and sing a song. We'll ask Alan White to lead us in our opening prayer. When upon life's billows you are tempest tossed, when you are discouraged thinking all is lost, count your many blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done. So amid the conflict, whether great or small, do not be discouraged, God is over all. Count your many blessings, angels will attend, help and comfort give you to your journey's end. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done.
Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this day that you blessed us with, Father. Thank you yet again for allowing us to come here, sing, and to be able to listen to another portion of your word, Father. We pray that you would be with Brother Ed and be with all the teachers here, Father, as they are about to teach. And we pray that you will bless them and help them to remember what they have prepared. Be with us as listeners. Allow us to listen with an open heart. Pray that we can apply it to our lives so we can be better service to you, Father. Pray that you'll be with all those who are sick, unable to be with us. Comfort them and help them to regain their health, Father. Be with us throughout the remainder of this worship service. Continue to bless us with gifts when we fail thee. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Barry, for leading us in a beautiful song, and Alan for leading us in a good prayer. It's good to see all of you, and in case you hadn't heard, it's supposed to rain a little more tonight. But I think winter's going to return, so we can get ready for that. Candace is fanning, though. It doesn't make any difference what time of the year it is. Matthew 23, we're summing that up tonight and trying to connect it with chapter 24. Because Matthew 24 is a chapter that is talked about a lot in religious circles today. There are many misunderstandings about it, and I do not pretend to know everything about Matthew 24, but I think there are some very important principles that we need to establish and make connections between what Jesus has said and done in Matthew 23 and what he talks about then in chapter 24. But Matthew 23 could be summed up, I think, as Sellers Crane did in his commentary, that this chapter is really about true religion. And I think he makes some excellent points, and I'm going to reiterate some of those tonight. Matthew 23, as you know, is devoted to a series of woes, and that word, the Greek term for woe, denotes sorrow. And it indicates the Lord's sorrow for the spiritual state of Israel. He loved the nation of Israel. He loved all the Jewish Hebrew people. And of course, he was sorry that the judgment that had been predicted was going to be coming upon them as a result of their sinfulness and their rejection of God. And there are several statements in Matthew 23 that are interesting in that connection. Brother Crane mentioned 5 lessons about true religion that he drew from this chapter. And like I said, I want to mention those. He takes the first 12 verses and says that these verses teach us that an act can be religious without being righteous. And I think that is a wonderful point for all of us to remember. There are many, many acts of religion that are done today. But just because they're done in the name of religion does not mean that they're right, that they are what God really wants. And we see that clearly established in this particular section. These people were engaged heavily in religious activity, but their motivation was to be seen of men, not to please God. They wanted the accolades of the people. They wanted to be viewed as being very, very pious. And Jesus talked about their making broader their phylacteries and all of that. We talked about those, what those were. And the hems of their garments had tassels on them, and they were lengthening the tassels there. And all of this was supposedly to indicate that they were more righteous and more religious than other people were. And they were separatists. The word Pharisee, that's what it means. And they claimed to be separated from sin, but really they were not. So they wanted those seats of honor, and they wanted to be held in high esteem by their fellow Jewish people and the people that saw them and so on. But their motives invalidated their actions. So motive is vitally important. Why do we do what we do in religion and in our worship and so on? A second thing that he mentions is that an act may be religious without even being beneficial. It may be religious, but not beneficial. And in many instances, those acts could even be harmful. And he mentions the Pharisees' attempt to convert people. But to what were they converting them? They weren't wanting to convert them to God. They wanted to convert them to the Pharisee sect. It's very difficult for the religious world today to even imagine a religious scene or setting or world where everybody would just be a Christian. There's so many hyphenations in religious circles today. You know, when you say you're a Christian, if somebody asks you tomorrow out on the street, what are you religiously? And you were to say, I'm a Christian, I would almost bet that the next question would be, what kind? What kind? And that denotes the great religious division. Brother Colley, Glenn Colley's dad, Gary, wrote, has an excellent article in this coming Spiritual Sword. I get mine, I've been on the mailing list for years, and so I get a Spiritual Sword before we get our bundles here. And so I get to read it a little bit ahead of time. But when we get those new Spiritual Sword edition, or this edition, I hope that you will make it a point to read all of it. But I hope you'll notice the article that he has written, because it's very good and mentions the importance of religious unity. And wouldn't it be just wonderful if all the Christians, all the people who say they're Christians in every location, in every town, were just in one group to worship like the New Testament tells us to worship, you know? And somebody says, well, that'd be impossible because of things like the instrumental music question and things like that. And you're probably right, because there are people who are not going to give those up. Barbara used to tell me about an individual who said they were having a testifying service in a religious gathering, and this fellow got up and testified, and he said, I'm glad to be an American. I am glad to be a Christian, but most of all, I am glad to be, and he named the religious group of which he was a member. Now that denotes the problem, you know. Why not just be a Christian? What kind of a Christian? Well, faithful Christian. A Christian who serves, a Christian who brings honor and glory to God. Brings honor to Christ by wearing His name, not some human name or some name that has been dreamed up. I hadn't added anything to the list recently, but I have a list somewhere that of all the different names I have seen on church signs. And it is amazing the names that you'll find. And usually, most churches today are named after a concept. The Joy Church, or something like that. You see that all the time. You know, what greater name can we wear than simply the name of Christ? There's nothing greater than that, because His name is above every name. But they were converting people, yes, but they were converting them to Pharisaism and not to true service to God. And He said, you know, you'll compass land and sea to make one convert, and then you turn him into, you know, a person that's even more condemned than he was initially because of all these things. Then the third thing that Brother Crane points out is an act may be religious without being adequate. He didn't condemn the Pharisees for being faithful in things that were minor, because the Jews were tithing even the most insignificant of things, like the mint and the anise and the cumin and all of that. But He condemned them for majoring in those things instead of thinking about the weightier matters of the law, like truth and justice and mercy and stuff like that. So, you know, you can be involved in a religious act, but it may not be adequate. And then he makes this point from verses 29 through 36, that an act may be religiously visionary and idealistic, but it's useless if it isn't carried out. And the example that he uses here is the example of the Pharisees honoring the tombs of the prophets who had gone before them. Those tombs had been decorated, and sometimes a mosque of a type building built over them, and they knew exactly where they were, and they revered them, and all of that. And these were people that their forefathers had killed. Well, what did they learn from that? They said, well, we wouldn't have done that if we'd been living then. But what were they doing? They were doing the very same thing. They persecuted John. He was put to death. They persecuted Jesus. And they would eventually, Jesus predicted that it would happen, and it did, put His apostles to death and others who preached the gospel. And so they didn't really learn anything. I mean, it was good to revere the prophets. And that shows that they had some degree of appreciation for those who'd gone before them. But they really didn't change their hearts. And that's the problem. And then the fifth one that he mentions is that those who engage in religious acts that are wrong do not have to remain wrong forever. They needed to repent. And now that brings us to the final two verses of chapter 23 that we did not talk that much about last time. You've heard me refer to this passage many times and tell the story about the little hen, that saved her chickens back on our farm in Jackson County as a hawk swooped down and killed her, and we didn't know where the chicks were, and after maybe a minute, we began hearing peep, 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 and sure enough, those little chickens came out from beneath their mother as she lay there dead on the ground. I can still see that as vividly as if it was yesterday. And boy, that passage or that happening made me appreciate this passage of Scripture, because it tells us that Jesus will die for us, did die for us. But notice how he talks to Jerusalem, and it's the last three verses. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Who else used an expression very similar to that in the Old Testament? Oh, Absalom, Absalom. Yeah, David did that. Now, Bible scholars tell us that expression, those expressions are very, very similar. That when you use the exclamatory "oh" and then repeated the name a couple of times, that it was a very powerful expression of hurt and sorrow. And so we know that David wept bitterly for Absalom. But Jesus, opinions are divided about whether this is another occasion where he wept. One of the writers mentions, I believe, that he did, but I don't think I would have any problem concluding that, because of the very nature of the words that are spoken here. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them that are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not. And then he says, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. What house is that? What do you think it is? I believe it's a reference to the temple. Do you all have any other ideas about that? In view of the context, that would seem to be, of course, a lot of their personal homes, dwellings, would be destroyed too by Titus and in the Roman siege that would come some 40 years after these words were spoken. But the temple is going to be destroyed. Do you not think Jesus loved the temple? Well, sure he did. How many temples were there? How many? 2? Really, most people refer to 3. They refer to Solomon's temple. David wanted to build the first temple and purchased some land to do it, and so on. The history of this area goes way back. Remember, Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, and he was from Salem, Jerusalem. Those last letters are the same as the Salem we pronounce it. It's probably pronounced a little bit differently by Orthodox Jews because they know the Hebrew language. But you would have David buying this area from the Jebusites and wanting to build the temple there, and he got all the stuff together, and all of that, but Solomon would be the one who built it. So it was called, or is called, Solomon's Temple. Well, it stood around 300 to 400 years and was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And then when the children of Israel came back from the exiles, Zerubbabel was the primary builder of the temple. There were others that were involved. And so it became known as Zerubbabel's temple. And then when Herod the Great was given the oversight of that particular area, he enhanced the temple tremendously. And there were, and I've read that it continued to be refurbished and embellished right up until about in the 60s before it was destroyed in AD 70. I think about 6 or 7 years prior to its fall or its destruction, it was still being worked on. And very elaborate structures were built there. We'll jump ahead just a little to chapter 24, verse 1, and since I'm talking about that, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. Herod had built a lot of palaces there, and so that area was really beautiful. And it's said that the sun was so bright, shining on the walls that were plated with gold, that you couldn't look at it when the sun was hitting it directly. He said it had the same effect as you looking directly at the sun. You just, you can glance, but then you have to get your head down. You just can't look at the sun very long at a time. And that would tell you something about how great this house was. And one writer said that it came very near to being one of the 7 wonders of the world, and that it was beautiful to behold. But he said, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, you shall not see me henceforth till you shall say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Now, this is perhaps a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem as being the fulfillment of all that Jesus has said. And there would no doubt be people who would recall the fact that Jesus talked about this day when that event occurred. And it may be a reference to the church was going to be established, but the church would have the mission of taking the gospel into all the world before Jerusalem was ever destroyed. And Colossians 1 verse 23 reveals that the gospel had been preached to every creature. And many believe that these two things are tied together. In fact, in verse 14 of chapter 24, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. And the end that's being talked about, in my opinion, in that verse is the end of Jerusalem and the temple. Because he is seemingly in the first part of chapter 24, though they may be intermixed, he talks more about the destruction of Jerusalem. And then in the latter part of chapter 24, he is talking about the second coming and the end of time as we know it. But do any of you have any comments, preferably, questions about what we've talked about thus far? Another writer points out some of the things that the Pharisees were guilty of, and he lists about 8 things that I think are very helpful as well. The Pharisees made the mistake of not practicing what they preached. That's seen in verses 2 and 3 of Matthew 23. Second thing that they did was that they bound their traditions on others as if they were God's commands. They tried to make it appear that tradition was what these traditions were equal to God's truth. And we should never do that. There are ways that we may have done things they may not have been done exactly that way. Barry Cahoon asked me if I don't think he'd mind me mentioning this. We were talking out in the foyer earlier about the posture that is assumed in baptism, with us most of the time laying the subject back and bringing them up that way. And I said, well, there's no certain posture that we have to assume. And I told him, I said, I baptized people sitting in chairs, and a time or two we would just, have them sitting in the water and lay them back. They'd nearly be covered, but then just lay them back, and there would be nothing wrong with taking them forward. And all kinds of things could be used to illustrate. We can say, well, it's just always done that way. All of us have heard the story about the ham, and why you had to cut the end off of the ham. That's one of the funniest stories I ever heard in my life, one of the greatest illustrations I'd ever heard in my life, first time I ever heard it. And most of us know it. If you don't know it, well, I'm not going to tell it. You can ask me later, and I'll tell you about it. Why you should cut the shank off of the ham before you cook it. And the third thing, they were more concerned with their reputation among men than their reputation with God. The greatest question we can ask is, what does God think about this? What would God think about me if I did that? That ought to be our primary consideration, shouldn't it? But what are people going to think? What are people going to think? Well, I'll guarantee you, people are going to think. They're going to think something. They'll think something about you. They'll think something about me. People are prone to do that. And we all kind of do that, don't we? We think. And I remember Glenn Ramsey saying one time in the debate out here, sometimes when people who think they think might need to think again, or words to that effect. I can't remember exactly how he said it, but it was that was the idea. But we do need to really think about what God thinks about this. How does God feel about it? Let's see what He says about it. Does He say anything in His Word about this? And then search the Scriptures diligently to see. I want people to think well of me, and you want people to think well of you. But when it comes down to having to decide between having the approval of God or the approval of men, we need to select the approval of God every time. Study to show thyself approved unto God. But verses 5 through 7 of Matthew 23 shows that they were more concerned about their reputation among men than with God. Number 4, they converted people to their group instead of converting them to God. We've talked about this before, and that laps over with Brother Cranes. They felt obligated to keep their word only when it was convenient. When you read about their oaths and so on, the things by which they would take an oath, it seems that they thought, well, if it's convenient now, I'll keep this. And if you've studied very much with us in the book of Matthew, you remember that some of the people Jesus talked about would say, now, I have set aside this money for the Lord. And so I can't use that money to take care of my parents. They would relieve themselves of obeying the commandment, honor your father and mother, by finding a loophole. And they would say, I've got to dedicate that. I've dedicated that money to the Lord. And so I can't use it to help my parents. And Jesus took them to task for that, because honoring their fathers and mothers was one of the basic commandments of the 10 that He gave. They were experts in rituals of worship, but novices in pure and undefiled religion. What is the religion that James teaches us to practice? pure and undefiled religion, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction. But that's not all. To keep himself unspotted from the world. Pure religion involves being pure from the contaminating influences of the world. We can't worship God properly if our hearts at the time of worship is so tied up in the things of the world. Now, I may get on some toes when I say this, but sometimes, and we've all been guilty of doing this, yours truly included, Lord, help us for a short time to put the cares of the world out of our minds. Do y'all think that's really an accurate way to look at it? Should we only, for a short time in worship, set aside the cares of the world? I began thinking about that some time ago, and I thought, I don't know if I can pray that prayer or not in good conscience. Jesus said, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, love of the Father is not in him. And he said, whoso loves the world loving the world is enmity with God. Now, I think I understand what we mean when we say that. At least I think I do. I may not. But I began to think about that, and I thought, it's almost like saying, while we're here in the building for that short time, let's not think about that, but as soon as we hit the vestibule or as soon as we get outside, we, just let it overwhelm us again. That's not the idea. Do y'all remember the signs that, I believe we used to have them here. Help me to remember if I'm wrong, correct me. We had a sign over the door that said, enter to worship. And we had one over the inside door that said, leave to serve. You enter to worship, but you leave to serve. Now, if you leave to serve, you're not going to be swept away by the cares of this world even after you get outside the building, you're away from a worship service. That's something to think about. If you disagree, you tell me. But just think about that. Let's think about it. Because these people, just didn't have it together when it came to pure and undefiled religion. And sometimes we forget that religion that's described in James 1 specifically says, unspotted from the world. You don't allow the world to set the way you live, and so on. Two more right quickly. They appeared righteous on the outside, but had not experienced inward renewal, verses 25 through 28 of Matthew 23. And that we have emphasized over and over again. The problem was the inside. Their hearts were not right. They dressed up the tombs. They did all that. They decorated those tombs of the prophets and so on, but there was something just wasn't right. They hated the Son of God, so much so that they were going to put him to death. The scribes and the Pharisees were the primary instigators of that. Finally, they were blindly repeating the sins of their fathers. Now, they don't have to do that. How many of us have, I'd say all of us, have known someone that when it came to having a father image and a good example from a father, they were not blessed with that. But they rose above that. They didn't follow in the footsteps of their father. While it is a general truth that like father, like son, that's not always the case. I've known some good, godly men who didn't have good, godly fathers. We probably all have known people like that. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that we don't have to repeat the mistakes of those who have gone before us. The gospel of Christ can change the lives of people. And I've personally observed it. You have too. Most of us have. And I told Barbara not long ago that a fellow that we both knew growing up, I never dreamed he'd be a Christian. But he is. And he's a faithful Christian. So we should recognize that those people, don't give up on them. You may say, oh, that person will never obey the gospel. You never know. Give him an opportunity. Be sure to do everything you can to get the word to him. Appreciate your patience tonight, and hope that these thoughts have been helpful in some way, and we'll look forward to next week, Lord willing. And my surgery is scheduled for Friday at 10:30. If you think of it, say a prayer for me at that time. For Barbara and the girls, they'll be with me. And I found out today that some people drive themselves back home in their pickup trucks. And I told the nurse that's what I would love to do, but I would never be allowed to do it because of this girl over here and my two daughters. But we're looking forward to being back with you Sunday, Lord willing.